When the lawyer slid a single, jagged brass key across the table, Arthur's brother got the $70 million estate. Arthur got Unit 42 at a collapsing self-storage facility off I-95. It was a final, calculated insult from a dead father. Except that rusted roll-up door was hiding the greatest historical discovery of the century. The mahogany conference table at Harrison & Associates was polished to a liquid shine. Arthur Hayes could see his own reflection in the wood. Dark bags under tired eyes, a jawline shadowed by 3 days of coarse stubble. He looked entirely out of place in the 42nd floor boardroom, a fact his older brother David didn't need to point out. David's posture did the talking. David sat impeccably straight, his custom-tailored charcoal suit perfectly pressed, checking his Rolex with the subtle impatience of a man whose time was literally money. At the head of the table sat Richard Gable, a lawyer who had spent 40 years turning their father's ruthless corporate takeovers into legally binding ironclad contracts. Gable adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat. The sound echoed in the cavernous quiet room. Their father, Thomas Hayes, was dead. Massive coronary at 71. He died exactly as he had lived, behind his desk, barking orders into a phone, yielding to no one until his own heart forced a hostile takeover. Moving on to the primary assets, Gable said, his voice a dry, papery rasp. Arthur tuned out. He already knew the score. He had known it since he was 18. Thomas didn't do unconditional love. He did return on investment. David was the aggressive, sharp-elbowed protege who had climbed the ranks of Hayes Enterprises by mimicking their father's ice-cold demeanor. Arthur was the disappointment, the liability, the kid who wanted to study history, who cared more about preserving crumbling municipal archives than bulldozing them for luxury condos. Thomas had cut Arthur off a decade ago, calling his career choice a pathetic retreat from the real world. To my eldest son, David, Gable read, his eyes tracing the thick linen paper, I leave the entirety of my voting shares in Hayes Enterprises, the primary residence in Connecticut, and the offshore holdings detailed in Appendix A. David didn't flinch. He didn't smile. He just gave a curt, tight nod. Expected. Calculated. Gable paused. He looked up, his gaze settling on Arthur with something that might have been pity. Pity was worse than contempt. To my youngest son, Arthur, Gable continued, his tone dropping half an octave, who always preferred the dust of the past to the demands of the future, I leave the sole contents of Unit 42 at the safety store facility on Route 9. Silence stretched across the boardroom. David let out a short, breathy scoff. He covered his mouth, but the amusement was clear in his eyes. Gable reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a small, manila coin envelope. He slid it across the vast expanse of polished mahogany. It stopped inches from Arthur's folded hands. Arthur stared at it. He didn't reach for it. A storage unit. A rusted metal box on the side of a decaying highway. It was brilliant, really. Thomas Hayes was a master of the psychological knife twist. Even from the grave, he couldn't just leave Arthur with nothing. Nothing would be neutral. A storage unit was an active insult. It was a chore. A final assignment to clean up some forgotten garbage, a tangible reminder of exactly what the great Thomas Hayes thought his youngest son's time was worth. That's it? Arthur asked. His voice sounded remarkably steady, though his chest felt tight, constricted by a familiar, heavy resentment. That is the entirety of your inheritance, yes, Gable said softly. Arthur picked up the envelope. It weighed practically nothing. He tipped it over his palm. A single, brass master lock key slid out, the edges dull and lightly oxidized. Well, David said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket in one fluid motion. Wait, if you need to borrow a pickup truck to haul off whatever old patio furniture he left you, let me know. I think the landscapers have an extra one. Arthur closed his fist around the key. The metal bit into his skin. He didn't look at his brother. He didn't say a word. He stood, pushed his chair back, and walked out of the boardroom. The drive to the Route 9 industrial corridor took an hour. taking him further away from the glittering glass towers of the financial district and deep into the city's rusted, decaying outskirts. The sky overhead was the color of wet cement, threatening a downpour that never quite materialized. Arthur's 10-year-old sedan rattled over train tracks and potholed asphalt. The heater whined, struggling against the November chill. He kept glancing at the brass key resting in the center console. He should have tossed it in the lobby trash can. He should have driven home, poured a cheap scotch, and finally closed the book on Thomas Hayes. But the historian in him, the obsessive archivist that his father had so deeply despised, couldn't leave a locked door unopened. The safe tea store facility was a sprawling, depressing compound of corrugated orange steel and faded asphalt, surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with loops of rusted razor wire. The front office smelled intensely of stale cigarette smoke and cheap pine cleaner. A teenager behind bulletproof glass didn't even look up from his phone when Arthur showed him the unit number, just buzzed him through the heavy iron gate. Arthur drove his car down the narrow lanes between the long, low buildings, row after row of identical, fading orange doors, units holding the discarded debris of broken marriages, failed businesses, and downsized lives. He parked in front of Unit 42. The building was positioned at the very back of the lot, backed up against a steep concrete embankment. Weeds pushed through the cracked pavement at the base of the door. The roll-up door was streaked with dirt and oxidation. Arthur stepped out of the car. The wind whipped off the nearby highway, carrying the smell of diesel exhaust and damp earth. He walked up to the heavy steel hasp. A thick, heavy-duty padlock hung from it. He slid the brass key into the lock. It didn't want to go in. He jiggled it, applying pressure, feeling the gritty resistance of neglected tumblers. With a sharp shove, the key slid home. He turned it. Click. The heavy shackle popped open. Arthur pulled the lock free, its weight substantial in his hand, and tossed it onto the asphalt. He grabbed the metal handle at the base of the door and pulled up. It didn't budge. The tracks were seized with dirt and rust. He planted his boots, bent his knees, and threw his entire back into it. The door screamed in protest, a violent, screeching grind of metal on metal as it gave way and rolled upward into its housing. Arthur stood back, panting slightly, staring into the pitch-black maw of his inheritance. The smell hit him first. It wasn't the damp, mildewed odor of old clothes or rotting cardboard that he expected. It was a sharp, distinct scent, ozone, machine oil, and the dry, unmistakable aroma of aging, high-quality paper. It smelled like a museum sub-basement. Arthur reached onto the wall just inside the door, his hand blindly sweeping the corrugated metal until he found a heavy plastic light switch. He flipped it. Deep inside the unit, a single fluorescent tube flickered on, buzzing like an angry hornet. The harsh, bluish light spilled over the space. Arthur froze. Unit 42 was massive, much deeper than the standard units at the front of the lot. But it wasn't filled with old furniture or stacked moving boxes. The floor was covered in heavy, industrial-grade rubber matting. Down the center of the unit sat a massive object draped in a thick, dust-covered canvas tarp. Flanking this central monolith were rows of heavy wooden crates. These weren't cheap shipping boxes. They were custom-built, reinforced with steel strapping, and stenciled with faded alphanumeric codes. Arthur stepped inside. The heavy atmosphere of the unit swallowed the highway noise behind him. He walked slowly down the aisle between the crates, running a hand along the rough wood. They were pristine beneath the layer of surface dust. He stopped at a crate near the front. A heavy iron latch held the lid shut. He flipped it open. Inside, nestled in layers of custom-cut, acid-free foam, were hundreds of thick, leather-bound ledgers. Arthur frowned. He pulled one out. It was heavy, bound in dark green leather. He opened it. The pages were covered in dense, meticulous handwriting. His father's handwriting. He recognized the sharp, aggressive slant of the ink instantly, but the content made no sense. It wasn't stock margins or real estate acquisitions. It was a ledger of names, dates, and geographic coordinates. Item 402. Recovered. Munich, 1998. Origin. Warsaw, 1939. Rightful claimant. The Rosenberg estate. Status. Secured pending secondary authentication. Arthur flipped the page. Item 511. Intercepted. Geneva Black Market, 2004. Origin. Florence, 1943. Status. Verified. A cold prickle of adrenaline washed over the back of Arthur's neck. He shoved the ledger back into the crate and moved to the next one. He popped the latch. This crate didn't hold books. It held metal canisters, dozens of them, perfectly cylindrical, sealed with wax tape. Arthur picked one up. It was heavy, cold to the touch. He peeled back the brittle tape, the sound incredibly loud in the quiet unit. He twisted the metal cap. Inside was a reel of 35mm film. Arthur held it up to the harsh, fluorescent light. He unspooled a few inches of the celluloid leader. He squinted at the tiny frames. It was black and white footage, a cityscape, but not a modern one. Horses pulling carts, men in bowler hats. It looked pristine, completely unblemished by time or decay. He carefully wound it back and closed the canister. Thomas Hayes was a corporate butcher, a man who tore down historic neighborhoods to build parking garages, who fired thousands to boost quarterly earnings. Why would he have a climate control vault full of antique film and cryptically logged ledgers? Arthur turned his attention to the center of the room, the tarp. He walked over to the massive, draped shape. It was roughly the size of a small car, but taller, with sharp, jagged angles protruding beneath the heavy canvas. Arthur grabbed a fistful of the dusty fabric. He pulled hard. The canvas cascaded to the rubber floor with a heavy thwomp, kicking up a cloud of dust that danced in the fluorescent light. Arthur stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. Sitting in the center of the storage unit was a machine straight out of a steampunk fever dream. It was a staggering complex of brass gears, steel pistons, and delicate glass vacuum tubes, all mounted on a heavy, riveted iron chassis. It looked like a cross between an early telephone switchboard and a massive mechanical loom. Thick bundles of copper wire snaked through its interior like veins. Attached to the front of the machine was a heavy iron plaque. Arthur leaned in, wiping away a smear of grease to read the engraved lettering. It was in German. Z3, Reconstruction. Project Leiter, T. Hayes. Arthur felt the floor tilt beneath his feet. As a historian, he knew what the Z3 was. Everyone in his field knew. Built by Konrad Zuse in Berlin in 1941, the Z3 was the world's first working, programmable, fully automatic digital computer. It was a machine that predated the American ENIAC by years. It was the absolute genesis of the modern world, and it had been utterly destroyed by Allied bombing in 1943. No original parts survived, only fragments of schematics and rumors. Yet here it was, not a crude replica, but a massive, fully realized, perfectly engineered machine sitting in a storage unit off Route 9. Arthur walked slowly around the colossal machine. The level of detail was staggering. The relays, thousands of them, were meticulously wired. The father who had mocked Arthur for looking backward had spent God only knew how much time and money secretly rebuilding a lost piece of technological history. But why? Arthur rushed back to the first crate, the one with the ledgers. He grabbed a different book, one at the bottom of the stack, thicker than the others. He cracked it open. The pages were filled with Thomas's aggressive scrawl, but the tone was entirely different from the cold, clinical ledgers. It was a journal. October 14th. The acquisition from the Munich broker is confirmed. It cost $3 million off the books. David would call it a terrible investment. He only sees the numbers. He doesn't understand the debt. None of them do. They think I build empires. They don't know I'm just trying to buy back the soul this family sold 80 years ago. Arthur stared at the page, the words blurring as his mind raced. The soul, this family sold. He flipped frantically through the pages. The journal documented decades of obsessive, secretive work, black market auctions, private investigators hired to track down lost artifacts. Millions of dollars siphoned from Hayes Enterprises through shell companies to fund this underground vault. His father wasn't just hoarding history, he was rescuing it. Arthur looked up from the ledger, his eyes sweeping over the rows of crates. How many canisters of lost film? How many stolen paintings? How many blueprints of machines that could have changed the world decades earlier? Thomas Hayes had been leading a double life. By day, a ruthless titan of industry. By night, a desperate, obsessive archivist. He had built a secret museum of the lost, the stolen, and the destroyed, and he had left the key to the son he supposedly hated. Arthur looked at the heavy brass key sitting on top of the crate. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't a joke. It was a transfer of command. He walked over to the massive Z3 computer. He reached out and touched a cold brass gear. It shifted slightly under his fingers, smooth and perfectly oiled. The machine was waiting. The crates were waiting. Arthur's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was David, probably calling to ask if he'd found any old lawnmowers to sell. Arthur pulled the phone out, stared at his brother's name on the screen for a long second, and then powered the device off. He tossed it onto the rubber mat. He didn't have time for Hayes Enterprises. He had real work to do. Arthur didn't leave Unit 42 for 3 days. He existed on stale vending machine pretzels from the front office and metallic-tasting tap water from the filthy restroom down the hall. His tailored suit was ruined, the knees stained with decades of industrial dust, the collar limp and smelling of grease. He didn't care. He was tearing through a graveyard of history. The deeper he dug, the heavier the air became, thick with the unsaid truths of the Hayes dynasty. There were crates of architectural blueprints, hand-drawn, original schematics for structures bulldozed during urban renewal projects in the 60s. There were letters, thousands of them, bundles of correspondence between scientists, dissidents, and artists whose names had been scrubbed from official state records during various global purges. But the core of the collection, the bleeding heart of Thomas Hayes's obsession, sat inside a plain, reinforced steel lockbox at the very back of the unit. Arthur found it on the morning of the 4th day. It was heavier than it looked, secured with a biometric thumbprint scanner that had been crudely bypassed with a hardware hack, replaced by a simple mechanical rotary dial. Thomas had left the combination scrawled on the back of a dry cleaning receipt tucked into the final ledger. 3141. Pi. A rare cynical joke from a man who had never smiled in family photographs. Arthur spun the dial. The steel latch clicked open with a heavy, satisfying thud. Inside lay a single, crumbling manila folder and a rusted Luger pistol. Arthur ignored the firearm. He reached for the folder. The paper was dangerously brittle, threatening to disintegrate under his calloused fingertips. It contained a series of yellowed shipping manifests and a typed manifesto dated 1944 bearing the letterhead of Hayes Industrial Steel, the massive foundry their grandfather, Henry Hayes, had founded. Arthur began to read. The armor of cynicism that usually protected him began to fracture, piece by piece. Hayes Industrial Steel hadn't made its initial fortune building bridges in Ohio. That was the sanitized, PR-approved corporate myth taught in business schools. The truth was spelled out in faded typewriter ink. Henry Hayes had been a shadow profiteer. He had quietly financed a network of ruthless scavengers and fixers who followed the frontline troops across Europe, stripping devastated cities of their cultural and technological wealth. The Z3 fragments, the suppressed patent documents, the priceless art stolen by the Reich and subsequently liberated by Henry's private recovery teams, only to be sold into the deepest, darkest channels of the international black market. The Hayes empire was built entirely on stolen ghosts. Arthur dropped the folder onto the rubber matting. He sat back on his heels, the harsh, fluorescent light burning his bloodshot eyes. It made perfect, agonizing sense. Thomas Hayes, the ruthless corporate butcher, had discovered his father's sins. Maybe he found the lockbox after Henry died. Maybe the guilt had been quietly eating him alive while he sat in that mahogany boardroom, projecting invincibility to the shareholders. Thomas couldn't dismantle the company. The board of directors would have removed him instantly, buried the truth in litigation, and continued printing money. So, he fought a covert war. He used the very wealth generated by the plunder to slowly, painstakingly, buy back the stolen fragments of history over 4 decades. He couldn't go public. The legal fallout, the international treaties, the sheer scale of the theft would have destroyed everything, leaving the artifacts locked in decades of bureaucratic limbo. So he built a tomb, a purgatory for the displaced, and he chose Arthur. Arthur dragged a trembling hand down his face, feeling the rough scrape of his own beard. Why not just tell him? Why the 10 years of bitter estrangement? Why mock his degree in archival history, calling it a pathetic waste of tuition when it was the exact skill set required to manage this monstrous task? He found the answer on the inside cover of the manila folder, a short note written in Thomas's aggressive, sharp slant, dated just 3 months before the fatal heart attack. Arthur, if you are reading this, I am dead, and you are angry. Good. Anger keeps you sharp. Sentimentality makes you careless. I had to push you away. If the board, or your brother, suspected for a single moment that you and I were aligned, they would have monitored you. They would have found this place. David is a shark, exactly as I trained him to be. He protects the bottom line. You protect the truth. The world doesn't need another CIO. It needs a custodian. You are the only one who knows how to categorize, preserve, and eventually repatriate these items in secret. I bought them back. Now you have to get them home. Forgive me the cruelty. It was the only cover I had. Arthur stared at the words until they blurred into gray streaks. His chest heaved. The cold, unfeeling father was a phantom. The man who died behind that desk was a soldier fighting a lonely, desperate war for redemption. He picked up the rusted Luger, feeling its heavy, unbalanced weight, and set it carefully back in the box. He didn't cry. Crying was for men who had lost something. Arthur hadn't lost a father. He had just met him for the first time. The transition wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, deliberate fade from the world of the living into the realm of the past. Arthur didn't return to his tiny city apartment that week. He drove back only once, packing his meager belongings into a rented van, breaking his lease and draining his modest savings to secure a long-term commercial lease on an abandoned textile warehouse 3 towns over. Unit 42 was too small, too vulnerable to the elements and prying eyes. The collection needed a proper sanctuary. Moving the Z3 computer was a logistical nightmare that aged him 5 years. It took 3 weeks. 2 trusted, heavily paid freelance movers who thought they were hauling custom movie props, and a rented box truck equipped with a hydraulic lift. Arthur oversaw every excruciating second, his heart hammering against his ribs every time the massive machine tilted. He didn't speak to David. He received 3 voicemails from his brother regarding the signing of final probate documents, each progressively more annoyed and clipped. Arthur signed them via a silent courier, permanently relinquishing any lingering claim to the offshore accounts, the stock options, and the sprawling Connecticut estate. David got the empire. Arthur got the ghosts. It was a perfectly fair trade. The new warehouse was a cavernous, windowless block of brick and reinforced steel. Arthur spent his first month fortifying it. He installed commercial-grade climate control systems, industrial dehumidifiers, and a closed-circuit security grid that rivaled a Federal Reserve Bank. He bought heavy-duty shelving, acid-free storage boxes, and specialized conservation tools. Then, the real work began. He became a ghost himself. He lived in a small office partitioned off from the main warehouse floor, surrounded by the constant hum of the climate control and the dry scent of aging paper. He categorized, he cross-referenced. He spent grueling nights deciphering Thomas's cryptic ledgers tracing the bloody provenance of stolen Italian frescoes and suppressed blueprints for clean energy engines patented in the 1950s and subsequently buried by oil interests. It was a highly dangerous game. Repatriating the items meant contacting foreign governments, private estates, and international museums without exposing his own identity or the Hayes family connection. He couldn't just mail a priceless stolen artifact through standard international post. He started small, a collection of personal diaries belonging to a Polish resistance fighter, stolen by Henry's scavengers in 1945. Arthur spent weeks establishing a secure encrypted channel with a museum in Warsaw. He posed as a third-party legal intermediary representing an anonymous client looking to return stolen property. He arranged a blind dead drop in a neutral location in Switzerland, utilizing a highly vetted private courier. When the museum authenticated the diaries and released a tearful public statement regarding their miraculous recovery, Arthur sat in his warehouse office, drinking cheap, bitter coffee, watching the news feed on his monitor. A quiet, fierce satisfaction settled deep in his chest. One ghost laid to rest, hundreds more waiting in the dark. Months bled seamlessly into a year. The warehouse transformed from a chaotic storage space into a meticulously organized, world-class archive. The Z3 stood proudly in the center, a towering monument of brass and glass, fully cleaned and preserved. Arthur didn't attempt to turn it on. He wasn't a mechanical engineer, but he ensured the gears would never rust again. The financial strain, however, was immense. Thomas had spent millions acquiring the artifacts, but he hadn't left Arthur a liquid operating budget to run a shadow museum. Arthur funded the preservation through extreme frugality and occasional, highly careful sales of items that held absolutely zero historical significance. Some of Henry's leftover gold bullion and generic, uninscribed jewelry from the lockbox. It was a daily tightrope walk over a gaping chasm of bankruptcy. One rainy Tuesday evening in November, exactly a year after Thomas's death, the heavy steel door of the warehouse buzzed. Arthur looked up from his desk. He wiped his hands on a solvent-soaked rag, checking the security monitor. A sleek, black town car idled in the wet alleyway. A lone figure stood under the harsh glare of the security floodlight, holding a large umbrella. David. Arthur felt a cold spike of pure adrenaline. He had been so careful. Shell corporations, fake names, encrypted servers routed through 3 different countries. How had David tracked him down? He walked out of the office, his heavy boots echoing in the vast, quiet space. He stopped at the reinforced door and hit the intercom button. "We're closed," Arthur said, his voice flat, distorted by the cheap exterior speaker. "Open the door, Artie." David's voice crackled back. He sounded tired, not angry, not commanding, just thoroughly exhausted. "I know about the Munich wire transfers. I know about the safe house lease in Geneva. I know exactly what Dad was doing." Arthur hesitated. He looked back at the Z3, at the endless rows of crates holding the true, terrifying cost of their family's prestigious name. If David wanted to, he could call the federal authorities right now. He could seize the assets, bury the history forever to protect the corporate stock price, and have Arthur arrested for possession of stolen international property. Arthur took a breath and threw the heavy deadbolts. The metal door swung open, letting in the smell of wet asphalt. David stepped inside, shaking the water from his umbrella. He was wearing a bespoke suit, but the razor sharpness was gone. The bags under his eyes rivaled Arthur's. He looked older. He looked exactly like Thomas on the day he died. David looked right past Arthur. His eyes swept over the massive climate-controlled floor, the pristine shelving, the towering Z3 computer resting under the warm lights. For a long, heavy minute, neither man spoke. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic hum of the dehumidifiers working to keep the past alive. "He left me the company," David finally said, his voice quiet, completely lacking its usual aggressive edge. He left me the boardroom, the headaches, the lawyers, and the blood money. David turned his gaze back to Arthur. He left you the only thing he actually cared about. Arthur crossed his arms, his jaw tight. Are you here to take it? David scoffed, a hollow, bitter sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Take it? God, no. I looked at the ledgers I found hidden in his private wall safe. The legal liability sitting in this room alone could dismantle Hayes Enterprises in a single afternoon. He reached into his dark coat pocket. Arthur reflexively tensed. David pulled out a thick, unmarked white envelope. He held it out. What is that? Arthur asked, refusing to step forward. Dad wasn't the only one who knew how to hide money, David said smoothly. I found a ghost account, an old corporate slush fund Henry set up in the 70s to dodge the IRS. It's clean, it's untraceable, and it's got about $8 million sitting in it. Arthur stared at the envelope, his mind racing. Why are you giving this to me? Because I'm a pragmatist, Artie, David said, stepping forward and shoving the heavy envelope directly into Arthur's chest. Arthur instinctively grabbed it before it fell. I build things. I make the quarterly numbers go up. I can't do what you do. I can't scrub the blood off our family name. But I'm not going to pretend it isn't there anymore. David turned around, walking slowly back toward the rainy alleyway. He stopped at the threshold, the rain splashing against his polished shoes, and looked over his shoulder. Keep the doors locked, little brother, and let me know if you need a better courier for the Geneva runs. David stepped out into the rain. The heavy steel door swung shut on its automatic hinges, the deadbolts latching with a heavy, final click. Arthur stood alone in the center of the warehouse, the thick envelope heavy in his hand. He looked at the rows of crates stretching into the shadows, the thousands of silent stories waiting to be told, the displaced, battered history waiting to finally go home. He wasn't just a disappointed son anymore. He wasn't a failure hiding in the archives. He was the custodian of the damned, and his shift was just beginning. If Arthur's journey into the shadows of history kept you on the edge of your seat, we need your help to unearth more hidden stories. Hit that like button, share this video with fellow treasure hunters and history buffs, and subscribe to our channel right now. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Drop a comment below telling us what you would do if you inherited a secret archive. Keep exploring, stay sharp, and stay endlessly curious.